The Scorpion was already broken before she left port. The crew knew it. They had a name for her. They called her the Scrap Iron. May 1968. The Cold War was at a particular kind of fever, not the acute crisis of Cuba, but the chronic, grinding, daily tension of two superpowers that had pointed nuclear weapons at each other for so long that the aiming had become routine. Submarines were central to this routine. American nuclear submarines tracked Soviet submarines. Soviet submarines tracked American ones. The ocean was full of this dark choreography, invisible to the surface world, conducted in silence at depth. USS Scorpion, hull number SSN 589, skipjack class, nuclear-powered, had been at this work for 8 years. She was fast, capable, and had once been considered one of the finest attack submarines in the fleet. By 1968, she was something else. She had a chronic freon leak from the refrigeration systems. An electrical fire had broken out in an escape trunk earlier in the year from a water leak that shorted a shore power connection. The propeller shaft seal was leaking seawater into the machinery. In 1967, she had experienced vibrations so severe the entire boat seemed to be corkscrewing through the water. No cause was ever found. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had flagged her in 1967 for a full overhaul, a comprehensive top-to-bottom refit that would have taken months and cost significantly more than the Navy wanted to spend. Instead, Scorpion received emergency repairs, a patch job. Her depth was restricted to 500 feet in lieu of the full sub-safe implementation that the Thresher disaster had mandated, but that had not yet been completed on the Scorpion. The crew went back out. One crewman, Dan Rogers, refused to go on the 1968 Mediterranean deployment. He told his superiors that he believed the Scorpion was a danger to her crew. He was reassigned. The Scorpion sailed without him. She completed her Mediterranean deployment without incident, tracked Soviet vessels, attended exercises with Allied navies, and in May 1968 was given new orders. Divert from her return course to observe a Soviet naval flotilla operating in the Atlantic near the Azores. Monitor their movements, report, then come home. Her expected arrival at Norfolk, Virginia was May 27, 1968. On that afternoon, the families of her crew, wives, children, parents, waited on the pier at the Norfolk Navy Yard as they had waited for countless previous arrivals. The Scorpion did not come. Repeated radio calls using her call sign Brandywine went unanswered. The Navy's Situation Room in the Pentagon had a large chart of the Atlantic. Someone drew a line along the likely route from Gibraltar to Norfolk, 3,300 miles of ocean, and the search began. They searched for months. In late October 1968, the research vessel USNS Mizar, equipped with deep-sea cameras, found the Scorpion 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. She was 9,800 feet down. She had apparently impacted the ocean floor at speed and skidded, debris scattering across the seabed in a pattern that acoustic analysts had predicted using a technique called Bayesian probability, a mathematical method of estimating location that had never been used for this purpose before. The technique worked. It found the Scorpion. What the cameras revealed was a submarine that had not survived gently. The hull was torn, twisted, and bent. The forward section had been compressed. The sail, the fin that rises above the main body, had separated. One of the external running lights had been found in an open position, suggesting either the submarine had been near the surface when something catastrophic occurred, or that an internal explosion had forced it open from within. The investigation that followed produced one of the most contested rulings in U.S. naval history. The official Navy Court of Inquiry concluded that the cause of the sinking could not be definitively ascertained. And that was the conclusion they published. That was what the families received. But the story behind that conclusion is darker. The court's actual classified findings, declassified in 1993, 25 years after the disaster, concluded that the most probable cause was an explosion of large magnitude within the vessel, and the most likely source of that explosion, according to acoustic analysts who had studied recordings from the Navy's Socius hydrophone network, was a torpedo. Specifically, a Mark 37 torpedo with a faulty battery. The battery used a thin metal foil barrier to separate two volatile chemicals. When the foil degraded, which it did over time, from the vibrations normally experienced aboard a nuclear submarine, the chemicals mixed. They generated heat. Heat caused a runaway reaction. If that reaction reached sufficient temperature while the torpedo was still in its tube, the result would be ignition, a hot run in submarine parlance. A live torpedo running hot in its own launch tube aimed at nothing and dangerous to everything. The operating manual for this scenario was clear. If a torpedo goes to hot run in the tube, it must be fired immediately out into the ocean away from the submarine. A running torpedo was designed to seek its target using acoustic homing. A torpedo fired from a tube, if it heard nothing in front of it and turned back toward its loudest nearby sound, would seek the loudest thing in range. In 1968, at 9,800 feet below the Atlantic surface, the loudest thing in range would have been the Scorpion herself. 99 men. The Navy's official position has never acknowledged the torpedo theory. No family has ever received an official explanation. The Ordnance Systems Command, which oversaw the Mark 37 torpedo, was cleared of responsibility in the non-public findings. A classified review panel completed in 1970, 2 years after the inquiry, took a different position entirely, suggesting mechanical flooding was the more likely cause. The Navy's position is that the cause remains uncertain. Uncertain. That word has sat with the families of 99 men for more than 50 years. What we know. The Scorpion was broken. She had a crew who knew she was broken. She had a crewman who refused to sail on her because he believed she was unsafe, and he was right, and he survived because of it. She sailed anyway, into the North Atlantic, toward the Azores, toward a rendezvous with a Soviet naval group that she was meant to observe without being observed. And on May 22, 1968, something happened. An explosion, a flooding, a torpedo, a combination of failures long deferred by a Navy that needed her to keep sailing and couldn't spare the months to fix her properly. The scrap iron went down with all hands. 99 men. Their names are on memorials. Their families received no definitive answer because the definitive answer was classified, and the classified answer was disputed, and the disputed answer was buried behind layers of institutional reasoning about national security and Cold War sensitivity that felt, to the people waiting for it, very much like silence. The wreck sits at 9,800 feet. It is protected as a war grave. The nuclear reactor is still down there. The 2 nuclear torpedoes are still down there. They will be there for a very long time. The Scorpion is still on eternal patrol. Unlike the Thresher, she went down in water warm enough that there is, theoretically, no mystery about what happened in the final moments. The acoustic recordings captured the sequence. The hull implosion was detected and timed. From the first catastrophic event to the final collapse, 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The same duration as the Thresher, 3 minutes. It comes up again and again in these stories the way certain numbers do in nightmares. 3 minutes from a working submarine to a debris field at the bottom of the Atlantic. 99 men. No distress call. No survivors. One crewman standing on a dock in Norfolk who had refused to go, who had said the ship was dangerous, and who spent the rest of his life knowing he had been right. No cause. Uncertain. The ocean does not offer certainty. It offers depth. The wives waited on the pier in Norfolk. Some of them had small children with them. Some of them had driven hours for the arrival. All of them had received no advance warning that anything was wrong, because the Navy did not know, and because even when the Navy began to suspect, the protocol was silence until certainty, and certainty never came. The search for the Scorpion lasted 6 months. During those months, the wives lived in a particular kind of limbo that has no civilian equivalent, officially notified that their husband's submarine was missing and presumed lost, but carrying the word presumed as though it were permission to hope. It was not. The Navy was being careful with language, not with feelings. The Scorpion was found, definitively placed at the bottom of the Atlantic with no survivable space remaining. The wives were notified. The children grew up without fathers. The cause remains officially uncertain. The files are still partly classified. The crew's names are on the memorial wall at the Naval Submarine Base New London, alongside the crew of the Thresher, alongside every other American submariner lost at sea. Eternal patrol. The scrap iron went to the bottom with all her secrets intact. So did the Navy. So did the Cold War. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. There are things that happen in war that soldiers don't put in their official reports. Lieutenant Spate was not a superstitious man. He had studied engineering before the war, he had a rational mind, and he had survived 2 years on the Western Front through careful observation and disciplined thinking, not through prayer or premonition or any belief in things that couldn't be measured. He was, by every account from the men who served under him, steady. The kind of officer you wanted in a dugout when the walls were shaking, because he never flinched, and he never panicked, and he always had a reason for every decision he made. This is what makes what he described so difficult to dismiss. The Ypres salient in Belgium was, by 1916, one of the most densely saturated killing grounds in human history. The city of Ypres itself, medieval, beautiful, famous for its cloth hall and its cathedral, had been reduced to a skeleton of roofless walls and exposed timber. The countryside around it was the same, a moonscape of craters and abandoned equipment and bodies that never quite stayed buried because the shelling never quite stopped. The British held a bulging line around the city, which meant they were surrounded on 3 sides by German positions, fired on from the front, the left, and the right simultaneously, a permanent geometry of death that had broken 3 successive armies and kept breaking new ones as fresh soldiers arrived and were fed into the machinery. The dugouts there were deep. You had to go deep because the German artillery knew exactly where the British lines were and shelled them on a schedule so regular the men could predict it. The deeper dugouts, 10–15 feet underground, had their own particular atmosphere, cold and damp, the constant faint sound of earth settling above your head, the smell of old timber and candle smoke, and men who hadn't properly washed in weeks. They were not comfortable, but they were, in the relative accounting of the Western Front, alive. Men slept in them whenever they weren't required to be in the open, which was as much as possible. Spate had been assigned to one of these positions for 3 weeks when the first encounter happened. He had fallen asleep at a small table. Still dressed, as was common, you slept in your uniform in case you needed to move quickly, which you always needed to do eventually. He woke in the small hours of the morning to find another officer standing at the far end of the dugout. He recognized the man immediately. It was a fellow officer, a friend, in the limited way that war permitted friendship, who had been killed in the sector 6 weeks earlier. Spate had attended the small burial. He had watched them put the man in the ground outside the wire. The figure was standing very still, looking at Spate with an expression that was not quite an expression, more the shape of one, the way a drawing of a face differs from a face. Then it turned and looked at the floor, not at Spate, at the floor, deliberately, slowly, the way you look at something when you're trying to direct another person's attention without using words. Then it was gone. Not gradually, not with any cinematic fading. Between one moment and the next, the figure was simply absent. The dugout was empty and cold and lit by the single candle Spate had left burning, and there was nothing in it except furniture and 2 sleeping enlisted men and the ordinary sounds of the front. Spate sat at the table for a long time in the dark. He was, he said later, not frightened. He was profoundly confused, the specific confusion of a man whose entire mental framework is built on the assumption that dead officers stay dead and who has just encountered data that his framework has no category for. He got up, walked to the spot on the floor where the figure had been looking, and stood over it. The earth looked ordinary. Boards, compacted soil, the faint impression of boots that could have belonged to anyone. He pressed his boot against the boards. They didn't flex in any unusual way. The sound was the same as anywhere else in the dugout, dull, solid, nothing underneath suggesting hollow space or recently disturbed ground. He stood there for 2 full minutes in the cold and the candlelight and could find nothing. He went back to sleep. He told no one. 3 nights later it came back. The same figure, the same stillness, but this time the pointing was more deliberate, more urgent somehow, with a quality that Spate described as structured, like receiving a clear order from a commanding officer whose face you can't see. The dead officer looked at the floor directly beneath his feet, and the look lasted long enough that Spate, sitting upright in the dark, felt something he would later describe not as fear but as instruction, as though he was being given specific information that he was required to act on. He felt the weight of it, the weight of someone who had come a considerable distance and had very limited time to make their purpose understood. In the morning, he told his sergeant he wanted the floorboards lifted at a particular location. He gave a mundane explanation, checking for water accumulation, inspecting the drainage. The sergeant complied without question because Spate was the kind of officer whose orders didn't require explanation, whose steadiness in 2 years of war had built an unspoken currency of trust. They dug 8 inches down. They found a German tunnel, and inside the tunnel, braced with careful timber framing and wired together with deliberate patient engineering, they found a charge of explosives. The detonation mechanism was set. Based on the condition of the components, it had approximately 13 hours remaining before it would fire. The dugout sat directly above. Every man in that section of the British line would have been killed without warning, without sound, without any possibility of reaction. The tunnel showed no signs at the surface, nothing to smell, nothing to see, nothing to hear. It had been designed to be invisible from above. The German engineers who built it had done excellent, careful work. Nothing would have found it. Nothing except a dead officer standing in the dark and looking at the floor. The charge was defused. Every man in that section of the line lived through that night and went on to the next night and the night after that. Spate filed no report about what had led him to order the search. He mentioned it, years later, in a private account, the kind that soldiers sometimes write in old age when they've stopped caring whether anyone believes them. He described the two appearances with the same precise, unembellished attention to detail he brought to everything, and noted that the figure had had what seemed like warm eyes, which he found strange for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, and that it had not seemed distressed, only purposeful. The way a man looks when he has one specific thing left to do and the time to do it is very short. The dead officer never appeared again after the explosives were found. Whether the tunnel would have been found by other means, perhaps, perhaps not. 13 hours is not a long time on a front where the shelling often prevented any systematic inspection for days at a stretch. A night raid, a supply inspection, a routine check, all of these were possible in 13 hours, and all of them were possible not to happen as well. Spate survived the war. He went home. He built things for the rest of his professional life, structures with solid foundations, buildings that knew what was underneath them. He lived to a reasonable age and was, by all accounts, content. The dead officer's name has been lost to the archive systems of a war that generated more documentation than any conflict in human history and still managed to misplace most of it. He is somewhere in the ground near Ypres, which is where most of the men who served in the salient eventually ended up. But for 3 nights in the cold dark of a Belgian winter, he stood in a dugout and pointed at the floor. And 13 hours before the end, someone finally listened. There is a frozen pond in a narrow valley in northern Norway that looks, from above, like nothing at all. A flat disk of winter ice between snow-covered hills. A shepherd might walk past it 100 times and find nothing worth noting. But beneath the ice, the water drops away without warning into one of the most demanding cave diving systems in the world, a passage that descends to 130 meters below the surface, deeper than most buildings are tall, and then squeezes through narrow stone corridors for more than half a kilometer before finally rising into a dry cave chamber on the far side of the mountain. The full traverse takes approximately 5 hours. The depth alone puts it beyond the reach of all but the most experienced technical divers in the world. On the morning of February 6, 2014, 5 Finnish cave divers arrived at the Plura pond in the Nordland region of Norway in the early pre-dawn hours, stiff from a long road journey over icy Norwegian mountain highways. They unloaded their gear in the freezing dark, 60 kilograms of equipment for each diver, including dry suits, closed-circuit rebreather systems, underwater propulsion vehicles, and multiple independent bailout gas cylinders for emergencies. They picked up a chainsaw and cut a triangular hole in the surface ice, the sound of it cutting through the pre-dawn silence of the valley. They had planned this dive together for months. They knew every segment of the route. They had studied every known hazard, briefed every contingency. Their names were Patrick Grönqvist, Jari Huotarinen, Vesa Rantanen, Jari Uusimäki, and Kai Kenkinen. They had been diving together for years, long enough to have built the kind of trust that develops only from putting your life into someone else's hands repeatedly in environments where a single mistake ends everything. Patrick was a professional firefighter in Finland. He had been part of the expedition that first discovered this precise route through the Plura system the previous year. For all 5 of them, this cave, this dive, this particular combination of depth and darkness and stone was the closest thing they had to a spiritual practice. This was what fully alive felt like to them. They divided into 2 teams. Patrick Grönqvist and Jari Huotarinen would enter first and make the full traverse to the exit on the other side of the mountain. Vesa Rantanen, Jari Uusimäki, and Kai Kenkinen would follow 2 hours behind using the same route. Both teams would surface on the other side and return together. No one had prepared a contingency for what happens when the first team encounters a catastrophe so total that they have absolutely no way to warn the second team before the second team descends into the same space. Approximately 1 hour into the dive, at a depth of 110 meters, Patrick Grönqvist became aware that Jari Huotarinen was no longer behind him. He turned back through the passage in the direction he had come, every extra minute spent at depth adding to the mandatory decompression time that would be required before he could safely surface, and found Jari tangled in the umbilical line tethered to his underwater scooter. The passage at that point was too narrow to maneuver with the equipment attached. Jari had become immobilized, and he was starting to panic. Panic at extreme depth is physiologically fatal in a way that is almost invisible from the outside. A panicking diver breathes faster and more shallowly. Faster breathing overloads the carbon dioxide scrubber in a closed-circuit rebreather, the component that removes CO2 from the recycled gas the diver breathes. When the scrubber is overwhelmed, it begins to fail silently. The diver continues breathing normally and begins to absorb carbon dioxide into their bloodstream without any sensation of suffocation or alarm. Within 2 to 4 minutes, they lose consciousness. In the conditions of Plura Cave at 110 meters, unconsciousness is death. Patrick passed his emergency bailout gas cylinder to Yari. Yari took several urgent breaths from it and then attempted to switch his mouthpiece, exchanging the rebreather mouthpiece for the bailout regulator while hovering in the dark at 90 meters of depth, wedged in a stone passage barely wide enough for a human body, with a current of cold black water pressing against him and his hands moving inside thick diving gloves. Jari Huortarinen accidentally inhaled water. He died in the passage within minutes. He died with Patrick beside him, watching, close enough to touch and completely unable to change what was happening. Patrick Grönqvist held onto the cave wall and forced himself to breathe with deliberate mechanical slowness, the way he had been trained to breathe walking into a burning building, one controlled breath at a time. He was still at depth. He could not ascend directly. The pressure differential at 100 meters required hours of staged decompression stops at progressively shallower depths before he could safely reach the surface, and surfacing too fast would kill him as surely as the water had killed Jari. He could not go back the way he had come. Returning through the full depth of the Plura system from this point would take 10 or more additional hours of diving and decompression. His only available exit was forward through the remaining half-kilometer of passage, across the deep sections, and up through the far exit on the other side of the mountain. He left Jari's body where it was. He turned forward into the dark and kept moving. 2 hours after Patrick and Jari had descended, the second team entered the ice hole in the surface and began their dive, completely unaware that one of the men they were following was dead in the passage ahead. When Vesa Rantanen reached the section of passage where Jari's body rested in the cave floor, he made the devastating calculation that most people would not be able to make, and he squeezed past. But when the next diver, Jari Uusimäki, came through and his headlamp illuminated his colleague's body in the rock ahead of him, the panic was instantaneous and total. He turned back. Kai Kenkinen followed, attempting to help. Jari Uusimäki died in the passage before they could exit the cave, in the same darkness, at nearly the same depth as the man whose body had startled him. Kai Kenkinen survived. He spent 11 hours navigating back through the deep sections of the cave alone, completing his mandatory decompression stops in total silence and total darkness, and finally broke through the ice surface of the Plura pond. The rescue teams waiting above had not known any of this was happening. Norwegian authorities declared the cave too dangerous for body recovery and sealed it. A British team of elite cave divers made an attempt and turned back. Jari Huortarinen and Jari Uusimäki remained where they had died, at 130 meters below the surface of the Norwegian winter. Then Patrick Grönqvist went to see Jari Huortarinen's widow. He looked at her directly and told her that her husband was not going to be left in the mountain. He promised her this. He then assembled a covert team of Finnish and Norwegian cave divers, planned the recovery with the obsessive thoroughness of people who understood that a single failure at that depth meant becoming part of the problem they had come to solve, and arrived at the Plura pond in unmarked vehicles in the middle of the night 7 weeks after the accident. The recovery was technically illegal. They did it anyway. On March 24, 2014, Patrick descended again into Plura Cave, into the passage where his closest friend had died, past the section of wall where he had held on and forced himself to breathe slowly, back down to 130 meters in the dark, and he found Jari Huortarinen exactly where he had left him 7 weeks before. Motionless, peaceful, still in his dry suit, still in the cold and the silence at the bottom of the world, exactly as Patrick had promised he would not remain. There is a documentary film called Diving into the Unknown that records this recovery. It is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of cinema ever made, not because of what it shows, but because of the faces of the men doing the diving, the absolute weight of a promise kept in a place where almost no one else on Earth could have gone to keep it. Some people leave the dark, some people go back into it, and some people go back into it twice. The note was found folded in the breast pocket of a dead man, wrapped in plastic to protect it from the water that had filled the compartment around him. It was dated 2 hours after the explosions that sank the submarine. The handwriting was steady. The man who wrote it was Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. He knew he was going to die. He wrote it anyway. It said, in part, all the crew from the 6th, 7th, and 8th compartments went over to the 9th. There are 23 people here. None of us can get to the surface. And then, below that, a message to his wife. 23 men, in a compartment at the rear of a nuclear submarine on the floor of the Barents Sea, 354 feet beneath the surface. Alive. For how long, even now, is disputed, but alive. Waiting. In the dark and the cold, with whatever oxygen they had, while the world above them, the Russian Navy, the government of Vladimir Putin, the rescue teams that arrived too late, and the foreign teams that arrived and were turned away, made decisions that sealed their fate as surely as the ocean did. This is the story of the Kursk. And it is not the story most people know. August 12, 2000. The Kursk, named for the site of the largest tank battle in history, was the pride of the Russian Northern Fleet. At 505 feet long, she was one of the largest attack submarines ever built, Oscar II class, double-hulled, carrying 24 cruise missiles capable of sinking aircraft carriers. She was on exercise in the Barents Sea, participating in Russia's first major naval maneuver since the collapse of the Soviet Union, an exercise meant to demonstrate that the Russian Navy was still a force that mattered, still capable of the power it had projected throughout the Cold War. The exercise was going well. The Kursk had fired one torpedo successfully. She was preparing a second simulated attack on the carrier Admiral Kuznetsov. At 11:28 a.m., the first explosion hit. Sailors aboard the nearby battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki felt the shockwave through the hull. Norwegian seismic monitoring stations hundreds of miles away registered the event at 1.5 on the Richter scale. The cause? A faulty weld in the casing of a torpedo fuel chamber had allowed highly volatile hydrogen peroxide propellant to leak. The propellant ignited. The resulting fire detonated the torpedo's 900-pound warhead. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, the accumulated heat from the first explosion reached the remaining torpedo warheads in the forward compartment. 5 to 7 warheads detonated simultaneously. The second explosion was registered at 4.2 on the Richter scale. It was felt as far away as Alaska. The forward 3 compartments, the torpedo room, the control room, the command spaces, were obliterated. Everyone in them died in seconds. The Kursk, on fire and flooding, sank to the seabed at a 20-degree angle. The nuclear reactors, protected by 13 centimeters of steel and their own emergency systems, shut down safely. In the rear of the submarine, the men who survived the explosions did what their training dictated. They moved aft, away from the fire, away from the flooding, into the rear compartments and, finally, into compartment 9, the emergency compartment, the last refuge, the rearmost space in the ship. 23 men. The lights were out. The reactors were off. The temperature in the Barents Sea in August is just above freezing. The men had battery-powered lights, emergency oxygen generators called chemical scrubbers, and each other. Kolesnikov wrote his note at 3:15 p.m., more than 3 hours after the explosions. He listed the names of all 23 survivors. He described the situation clearly and without panic. He noted that they could not surface. He said not to despair. He had reason for despair. The Russian rescue operation was a catastrophe from the first hour. The rescue ships arrived and found they could not seal properly to the Kursk's rescue hatch. The Russian diving bells were poorly maintained. The rescue capsule failed to dock on 8 separate attempts. Weather conditions worsened. For 5 days, the Russian Navy told the world and the families of the crew that communication had been established with survivors, that rescue was underway, that the situation was under control. None of it was true. The Russian Navy had no reliable contact with the Kursk. The rescue equipment was not working, and foreign governments, Norway and Britain, had offered deep-sea rescue capability within hours of the disaster. Russia declined the offers for 5 days. 5 days. On August 17, Putin finally accepted foreign assistance. Norwegian divers reached the Kursk on August 19 and opened the rear escape hatch in under 2 hours, something the Russian rescue teams had spent a week failing to accomplish. Inside, they found all 118 crew members dead. The investigation that followed reconstructed, from physical evidence and the notes recovered from compartment 9, the final hours of the survivors. Sometime after Kolesnikov wrote his note, when the oxygen supply began to drop, someone attempted to replace an exhausted potassium superoxide chemical oxygen cartridge, in the dark, in a compartment under growing pressure with oily water pooling on the floor. The cartridge was dropped. It hit the seawater. Potassium superoxide reacts violently with water. The reaction generates intense heat almost instantaneously. In the pressurized, oxygen-rich atmosphere of compartment 9, the result was a flash fire, burning through the remaining oxygen in seconds. The last survivors of the Kursk died in that instant. By best estimate, this happened sometime in the late hours of August 13. The note was written on August 12. They were alive for more than 6 hours after the explosions. The families were told for 5 of those hours that rescue was coming, that there was contact, that the crew was responding. Kolesnikov's note survived because he had wrapped it in plastic. His wife Olga received it through the Russian government months after the submarine was raised from the seabed in October 2001. She read the message he had written her in the dark, in the cold, in the last compartment of a sinking ship, while the world above him failed to move fast enough to save him. She has said in interviews that he sounded calm. She has said he told her not to worry. He was 27 years old. The Kursk disaster is documented, investigated, litigated, and publicly known. What it is not, what no public account has ever been able to make fully real, is the sensory reality of Compartment 9, the dark, the cold seeping through the double hull, the sounds of a submarine on the ocean floor, the settling, the pressure changes, the distant sounds of rescue equipment that kept failing to dock overhead, the 23 men breathing steadily, rationing air, listening. They banged on the hull. The rhythmic sound of metal on metal, the distress signal that submariners use when other communications fail, traveled through the Barents Sea water to Russian surface ships that either didn't hear it or couldn't respond in time. They were 354 feet down, a relatively shallow depth for a submarine. In good conditions, experienced divers can reach that depth. The water was cold, the visibility poor, and the conditions worsening, but Norwegian divers reached the hatch in 2 hours when they were finally permitted to try. The question that Russia has never fully answered, and that the families of the crew have never stopped asking, is simply, what if the foreign offer had been accepted on day 1 instead of day 5? No one knows. But 23 men spent their last hours in the dark in Compartment 9, waiting for a rescue that kept getting delayed, while governments weighed the optics of appearing to need help. The note survived, wrapped in plastic, steady handwriting, 23 names. Not to despair, Kolesnikov wrote. He was 27 years old, writing in the dark, at the bottom of the Barents Sea, while above him the world moved too slowly. The Kursk was scrapped. The compartments were sealed. A memorial was built in Murmansk from fragments of the hull. On it, 118 names are engraved. 23 of them spent hours writing goodbye. The strangest part of the story isn't what the officers heard at night. It's that they all heard the same things. From multiple sections of the Western Front, from officers and enlisted men representing 7 different armies, the reports arrived through different channels, at different times, from men who had never met each other and had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. And yet the accounts were consistent. Rifle shots at odd hours with no accompanying offensive action visible from either trench line. Sounds from the dark that were not wind and not artillery and not rats. And beneath it all, underneath the distant percussion of the guns, voices. Human voices, in multiple languages, rising and falling in what sounded like argument or celebration or something else entirely that nobody had a clean word for. The sounds of people who were neither British nor German and who were, by any official accounting, nowhere at all. No Man's Land was the strip of ground between the opposing trench systems. On some sections of the front it was 30 yards wide, on others a quarter mile. It was covered in barbed wire that had been strung, cut, shelled, and restrung so many times over 4 years that it had become a permanent environmental feature, a tangle so dense and so complex that it had developed its own ecosystem of rust and bone and fabric. Shell craters filled with water and the things that floated in it. There were unexploded artillery shells in it, and the remains of horses and vehicles and the equipment of men from 19 nations. Nothing was supposed to be alive in it for any extended period. Nothing was supposed to inhabit it. It was, by definition, the space that belonged to no one. The reports began circulating in 1916, though some soldiers believed the phenomenon was older, going back to the stalemate of late 1914 when both sides dug in and the front lines stopped moving and men began to understand that this was not a temporary situation, but a permanent condition. A legend spread from unit to unit, passed between men in the way that information travels in enclosed communities under extreme stress, by whisper, by inference, by the look on someone's face when they came back from the wire at 3 in the morning and didn't want to talk about what they'd heard. Lieutenant Colonel Arden Arthur Hume Beeman of the British Cavalry wrote about it in 1920, just 2 years after the armistice, in a memoir called The Squadroon. He was not a fanciful man. He was a career officer with the flat, systematic worldview of someone who had spent years in the professional hierarchy of the British military, and he wrote about the wild men of No Man's Land with the same measured tone he used to describe supply logistics and cavalry formations. At the Battle of the Somme in early 1918, he wrote, he watched 24 German prisoners of war walk into an area of abandoned trenches and simply cease to exist. They did not emerge from the other side, they did not appear in any prisoner records, they walked in and were gone, as cleanly as if the ground had opened and taken them. He considered sending a search party. He was advised strongly against it. The officer who advised him explained that the area, a network of abandoned and collapsed trenches extending for miles through the shattered landscape, was inhabited not by enemy combatants with a chain of command and a supply line and any recognizable military structure, by something else. Deserters from multiple armies who had slipped away from their respective units over the preceding years and gone underground. Into the old tunnels, the collapsed dugouts, the shell crater networks beneath no man's land. They had been down there for months, some of them reportedly for over a year. They had stopped reporting to any authority. They had stopped obeying any flag. They existed outside the entire architecture of the war that had created them. They emerged at night to take what they needed from the dead. At first, rations, then clothing when clothing wore out. Then, as months became a year, and then more as the darkness and the isolation and the particular diet of life underground worked its slow and irreversible changes on minds and bodies that had already been pushed to the edges of what humans can absorb, other things. Things the officer described only obliquely because the language for them didn't exist in any form he was willing to use in front of his commanding officer. They had stopped being soldiers. They had stopped being men in the way that word was commonly understood by people who had not spent 14 months in a tunnel eating whatever the dark provided. They were something the war had produced that the war had no taxonomy for. Humans who had decided that dying slowly underground in the company of the dead was preferable to dying quickly in the open under orders, and who had made adaptations to that decision that couldn't be undone. Every army heard the sounds. British officers pulled their men back from the parapet at night when they caught them leaning over the edge, staring out into the dark, listening to voices rising from positions that should have been empty. The voices spoke in English and German and French and Australian English mixed together, the way languages mix in places where national identity has been stripped away by something more fundamental than nationality. None of the salvage teams that worked the ground after the armistice ventured into the deeper tunnel systems alone or after dark. Some of the men on those teams, former soldiers themselves, men who had spent years in the trenches and thought they had been immunized against surprise by everything they had already witnessed, refused to work in the sectors where the sounds had been reported, and their refusals were accommodated without paperwork because the officers who managed those teams had heard the sounds too and did not want to issue a written order about them. The official instructions to those teams, distributed through military command channels and preserved in several national archives, specified that any underground passages encountered were to be sealed without entry. Paul Fussell, the scholar who studied the Great War more closely and more honestly than almost anyone before or since, called the legend of the Wild Men the finest story to emerge from the entire conflict, not because of its entertainment value, but because it was the only story that told the complete truth about what the Western Front was actually doing to the people caught inside it. Strip away civilization one layer at a time. Take the food, take the safety, take the belonging, take the purpose, take the sleep, take the future. Keep a man alive just enough to keep making choices, and you will find out what he chooses. What the war built between the trenches was not a ghost story, it was a mirror. Every soldier who stood at the parapet in the dark and listened to those sounds was looking at himself, at what he was 2 bad winters and 1 abandoned post away from becoming. That's why the legend spread from army to army across thousands of miles of front, passing between men who had never met and would never meet. Not because it was comforting, because it was the most frightening kind of true. No man's land was cleared after the armistice. The tunnels were sealed, the ground was slowly returned to farmland over decades. Some sections remain permanently off limits today, the Zone Rouge, the French government calls it, because the soil is still saturated with unexploded shells and chemical residue that has not degraded in a century underground. Nobody knows how many men went into those tunnels. Nobody knows how many of them were still alive in November 1918 when the guns stopped. In the years afterward, in towns across Britain and France and Australia, men appeared who had been listed as missing for years, gaunt, quiet, changed in ways that no medical terminology of the period could adequately describe. Some of them talked, most didn't. They had been somewhere. They didn't say what. She had been warned. Multiple people had warned her, clearly and directly, in plain language. She went in anyway, and she survived. But she was the only one who did, and living through something that killed everyone else around you is its own particular kind of sentence. It was October 2007, and Helena Carroll was 24 years old, on holiday in the Surat Thani province of southern Thailand with her boyfriend John Cullen. They had heard about Nam Talu Cave in Khao Sok National Park from other travelers, one of those wild adventure experiences that gets whispered about in hostel common rooms, the kind of thing that sounds too dramatic to be true until you look it up and find out it's even more dramatic than described. The cave was accessible only after a 2-hour boat crossing of a vast emerald lake surrounded by jungle limestone cliffs, followed by a 2-hour trek through dense, dripping rainforest. You paid a guide, you signed your name, you went inside, and you came back out, and you had a story. They signed up, they paid, they showed up at the meeting point ready to go. People warned them not to. It was the heart of monsoon season. The province governor had already issued a formal order closing the cave to tourism. The local people who lived near the park understood the October weather in that region from long experience. The rains came with almost no warning, sometimes within minutes, and when they did, the Nam Talu cave system channeled the water that fell on the jungle above it the way a funnel channels water into a bottle. Fast, completely, all at once. The locals knew this because the rains had done it before. They knew the sound it made. They knew how much time you had when you heard it, which was not enough time. But when Helena and John arrived, they were not the only ones who had signed up. There was a Swiss couple with 2 teenage daughters. There was a 10-year-old German boy traveling with his father who had decided at the last moment not to join. 2 Thai guides were leading the group. The warnings were mentioned, and the group looked at each other and looked at the clear morning sky and looked at the signs posted at the entrance in English and other languages and made the collective calculation that most people make in those situations, that the warnings applied to other people, to careless people, to people who were not paying attention the way this group was paying attention. They had guides. There were rules posted. How dangerous could it actually be? 20 minutes into the cave, Helena Carroll heard something she had never heard before and would never forget for the remainder of her life. It came from behind them, from the direction of the entrance they had walked through 20 minutes ago, a sound like a freight train, a deep, resonant, building roar that filled the cave tunnel completely and seemed to compress the air in front of it as it came. It was the sound of a mountain eating water and having no place left to put it. Helena turned around. The water hit like a wall of concrete. There was no rising flood, no gradual increase in water level, no slow creep across the stone floor. One moment the passage was stone and dim lamplight. The next, a torrent of brown water moving at terrifying velocity exploded through the cave tunnel, carrying with it everything the storm had driven into the mountain above. Mud in thick suspension, broken branches, loose rocks, anything that had been on the jungle floor moments before. The guides' flashlights were ripped away in the first second of the surge. The entire group was plunged into absolute darkness and absolute noise simultaneously. Helena heard screaming. Then she heard only the water. John seized her arm in the dark. They scrambled together upward along the cave wall, fingers digging into whatever holds the limestone offered in the pitch black, the torrent tearing at their legs and trying to rip them off the wall and carry them with it. Helena found a ledge above the floodline, a narrow shelf in the rock, and hauled herself onto it with everything she had. John was beside her, breathing in ragged gasps. Below them, the water surged and roared in the total dark. There was no way to see how deep it was. There was no way to see anything at all. John Cullen made a decision. The ledge was barely large enough for one person, and he was a practical man who loved her and was thinking as clearly as a person can think with floodwater roaring 3 feet below his boots. He told Helena that he was going to lower himself into the current and ride it to the exit, that caves like this were not long, that the entrance was not far, that the current would carry him fast and he would be outside in minutes, that he would bring rescuers back for her and that she simply needed to hold on, that he would be back, that she just needed to hold on. She watched him lower himself off the ledge into the dark water. The current took him immediately. He was gone. Helena Carroll sat alone in total darkness on a narrow shelf of limestone inside a flooded cave deep inside a jungle mountain in southern Thailand, and she waited. She could not see her own hands. She did not know if John had made it out. She did not know if the water below her was still rising. She did not know if anyone outside the cave was aware that anyone was still inside it. She sat in the dark for 8 hours. She did not speak. She had no light. She counted her own breathing. She thought about John. She thought about the sound the water made when it took him. She sat on a shelf of rock that she could not see and waited for something, anything, to change. Rescuers had known almost immediately that people were missing inside the cave. What they had not known was how far in. The flooding had been so fast and so total that the initial rescue attempts could not penetrate the entrance at all, and each attempt pushed rescuers back. One Thai guide at some point in the night refused to accept that there was no one left to find. He pushed further than the others had been willing to go, further than the conditions justified on any rational calculation, deeper into the cave past the point where most of his colleagues had turned back. He was right to do it. He found Helena Carroll on her ledge, alive, cold, and not speaking. She had been inside the cave for 16 hours in total when he reached her. She was helped out through the remaining floodwater and into the forest beyond the cave entrance, into the noise and the lights and the chaos of the rescue operation assembled outside. They were leading her toward the ambulances. She kept asking about John. She kept asking whether anyone had seen John. Someone finally told her the truth. John Cullen was dead. Every other person who had entered the cave that morning was dead. The Swiss couple, their 2 daughters, the 10-year-old German boy, both guides. Their bodies were already laid out on the grass near the cave entrance when Helena was helped past. 8 people had walked into Nam Talu cave that morning. 1 walked out. Helena has tried for years to find the rescuer who refused to give up when the others turned back, the man who pushed into the cave alone past the point of reasonable effort and found her on her shelf in the dark and brought her out. She has never been able to identify him. She does not know his name. The cave at Khao Sok was never properly and permanently closed after the 2007 deaths. In 2024, 17 years later, a Thai tour guide led another group into Nam Talu cave during a restricted period of the monsoon season. He slipped in the floodwater inside the cave. His body was found inside. The roar came without warning. It always does. That is the only thing about Nam Talu cave that has never once changed. At 9:13 in the morning, the most advanced nuclear submarine in the world sent a message that changed the Navy forever. It said, "Experiencing minor difficulties." 6 minutes later, the USS Thresher was gone. But what nobody talks about, what the classified files buried for decades, is what might have happened in the hours after she disappeared. Because another submarine, the USS Seawolf, heard something. Deep below the Atlantic, metal against metal, rhythmic, deliberate, like someone banging on a hull. Let's start at the beginning. The USS Thresher was not just a submarine, she was a statement. Launched in 1960, she was the fastest, quietest, deepest diving nuclear attack sub the United States had ever built. Her hull was constructed with a new high-strength steel alloy. She carried the Navy's most advanced sonar, the most sophisticated anti-submarine weapons system in existence. The Navy was so proud of her that they built an entire class of submarines around her design, 14 of them. Thresher was going to be the future. On April 9, 1963, she left Kittery, Maine, with 129 men aboard, 12 officers, 96 enlisted sailors, a Navy staff officer, and 17 civilian technicians and engineers from the shipyard who were along to observe post-overhaul sea trials. She rendezvoused in the open Atlantic with the submarine rescue ship USS Skylark, which would stand by on the surface while the Thresher conducted her deep diving tests. The night passed without incident. The morning of April 10 was clear and calm. At 7:47 a.m., Thresher reported she was beginning her deep dive test, a slow circular descent to her maximum test depth of 1,300 feet. It was a routine procedure she had done before, a controlled plunge into pressure, checking systems, verifying the integrity of every seal and joint and pipe fitting. Then she would blow her ballast tanks, fill them with air to increase buoyancy, and rise back toward the surface. Simple, procedural, safe. At 9:13 a.m., the Skylark received a garbled transmission over the underwater telephone. The exact words were partially lost in static. What came through, clearly and unmistakably, was, "Experiencing minor difficulties. Have positive up angle. Attempting to blow." A positive up angle meant the submarine was already tilting bow upward, trying to surface. Attempting to blow meant she was working the ballast tank system. These were not the words of a crew at rest. These were the words of a crew fighting. The Skylark tried to respond. Silence. At 9:17 a.m., just 4 minutes after that transmission, the Skylark's crew heard something through their equipment that investigators would later describe as the sound of a submarine hull collapsing under pressure, a deep, low pulse, not an explosion, something quieter and more final than an explosion, the sound of steel folding. Thresher was at approximately 2,400 feet when she broke apart. Her test depth was 1,300. She had gone nearly twice as deep as she was designed to go. The ocean took her in seconds. The investigation that followed lasted months and produced 1,700 pages of testimony from 120 witnesses. The official conclusion: a piping joint in the engine room had likely failed, one of hundreds of silver-brazed joints that had never been properly inspected. Cold seawater had sprayed across an electrical panel. The reactor automatically shut down. Without propulsion and taking on water, the crew had tried to blow the ballast tanks, but moisture had frozen in the high-pressure air system, a known flaw that had been reported and never corrected. The submarine, growing heavier as water flooded in, tipped, plunged, and imploded somewhere between 1,500 and 2,400 feet. All of that happened in approximately 3 minutes. From the first failure to the final collapse, 3 minutes. The Navy declared that all 129 men died instantly when the hull imploded. For 30 years, that was the official end of the story. Then, in the early 2000s, classified documents began to be released, slowly, partially, under court order, and something strange surfaced in the records of the USS Seawolf, one of the submarines dispatched to search the area. The Seawolf's operational log described diving to search for the Thresher not just on April 10, but on April 11. And then April 12, nearly 48 hours after the implosion. The log documented metal-on-metal sounds detected by the Seawolf's sonar, rhythmic sounds, the kind that might be made by someone striking a hull from the inside. The Seawolf attempted to communicate it, requested 5 bangs in response. More sounds were detected, though they were never confirmed to match the pattern. The experts who reviewed these documents are divided. Norman Polmar, one of the most cited naval analysts in American history and author of Death of the USS Thresher, flatly disbelieves that any crew survived past the implosion. The hull, he notes, was found in 6 separate pieces, scattered across the ocean floor at 8,400 feet. There is no structural mechanism by which any compartment could have remained intact. The sounds the Seawolf heard, he says, were almost certainly other ships in the area. But here's what no one can fully dismiss. The Seawolf's crew believed what they were hearing. They dove 3 times over 48 hours, convinced something was down there. The log entries are not the entries of people who thought they were chasing phantom noise. They are the entries of experienced submariners who believed, urgently and specifically, that they were communicating with someone alive on the ocean floor. No one will ever know for certain. The Navy's position has not changed. Everyone died instantly. The documents were eventually assessed as containing probable errors, the Seawolf most likely hearing the other search vessels and submarines operating in the crowded rescue zone. But consider this. You are aboard the Thresher. You are a sailor or a shipyard engineer aboard for what was supposed to be a routine test. At 9:13 you feel something wrong, a shudder, a sound, the lights flicker, the reactor alarm sounds. Somewhere behind you, water is getting in. You have 3 minutes. Your commanding officer is on the phone trying to reach Skylark. The ballast tank system is fighting ice buildup in the high-pressure air valves. The submarine is tilting, slowly at first, then faster. The gauges are moving in directions they should not move. The pressure is changing. The sounds the hull makes when it is under stress are sounds you have been trained to recognize. 3 minutes is both too long and not long enough. It is long enough to know. It is not long enough to change anything. The Navy eventually found the Thresher broken across the seabed in 6 major sections, debris scattered over a mile of ocean floor 8,400 feet down. Investigators described the wreckage as looking like a submarine that had been fed through a shredding machine. No remains were recovered. The Navy classified the site as a war grave. The Sub-Safe program, the most rigorous submarine safety overhaul in American naval history, was created directly as a result of the Thresher's loss. Every U.S. submarine built or modified since 1963 has been built to Sub-Safe standards. Not a single Sub-Safe certified submarine has ever been lost. The program is, by any measure, one of the most successful safety initiatives in military history. The 129 men of the Thresher are why. Their families received the standard notification. They waited on the pier in Groton, Connecticut on the afternoon of April 10, 1963, in the hours when the Thresher had not yet been officially declared lost, but the Navy already knew. The wives, the children, the parents, standing in the cold spring air at the waterfront, waiting for a submarine that had already been at the bottom of the Atlantic for hours. That detail, more than any technical failure, is the thing that refuses to leave. The Navy knew, the families waited, and 8,400 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, the USS Thresher lay in pieces, carrying 129 men into an ocean that would not give them back. The Seawolf heard something, metal against metal, rhythmic, deliberate. We will never know what it was. We will never know what the last 3 minutes were like. That is the horror the deep ocean keeps most completely, not the evidence, but the space where the evidence was, the absence shaped exactly like the thing that's missing. The Thresher is still down there. It has never been moved. It never will be. She is still on eternal patrol. The last sound the man made wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, and Corporal Louis Barthas carried it inside him for the next 36 years. It was the winter of 1916, somewhere deep in the trench network of northern France, where the Western Front had stopped moving and started rotting. What had once been countryside, farmland, villages, church spires rising into clear autumn sky had been hammered into a lunar wasteland 12,000 miles long. And the mud. If you've never read about the mud of the Western Front, understand this: it wasn't ordinary mud, it was a compound. Artillery shells churned the earth so completely, so repeatedly for so many months that the soil became fused with the remains of men who had already been buried in it, bones and leather and iron and flesh pressed together under rain and weight until it became something new, something thick, something that grabbed. Corporal Louis Barthas was a barrel maker from a wine-growing village in the south of France. He had 2 boys at home, Abel, 10, and André, 8, and a wife who maintained the household and prayed over the same photograph of him every night. He was 37 years old, politically a socialist, personally a pacifist, and professionally now a killer, because the French army had arrived at his door in August 1914 and handed him a rifle before he had time to explain the contradiction. He survived because of instinct and luck, and because of a gift for observation that compelled him to write everything down. Every night, when he could hold a pencil and find paper that wasn't soaked through, he wrote. He wrote in the dark, with shells landing close enough to shake the dirt from the walls of his dugout onto the page. That winter, he was marching his squad through a flooded communication trench after midnight. There were no lanterns. Light meant death. No moon, just the mechanical wet sound of boots pulling free from the mud with each step and the rhythm of men trying to breathe quietly in the cold. The smell was everywhere, always, that particular Western Front smell that veterans never described precisely because precision would require remembering it accurately, and nobody wanted to do that. They had been walking for hours. Everyone was exhausted in the way that goes past the body and into something deeper, something that changes a person permanently. Barthas had stopped feeling ordinary fear weeks ago. What replaced it was a kind of hollow endurance. You marched because stopping was death. You kept your head down because lifting it was death. You looked at the ground in front of you, and you did not look at the things that floated in the water at the bottom of the trench, because those things didn't need to be looked at. Then they heard the voice. It was low and steady, and it was coming from somewhere ahead around a bend in the trench. Not screaming, not pleading, just speaking, with the terrible preternatural calm of a man who has already fought panic for 5 hours and lost, and found something colder on the other side of losing. They turned the corner and stopped. A French infantryman was standing in the trench. His arms were free. His rifle was gone, swallowed an hour before. He had been there since before dark. The mud had consumed him to the waist. His uniform from the belt down was simply absent, and each time he shifted even the smallest amount, the earth made a quiet sound, and he sank another fraction. His face was gray from cold and hours of effort, but his eyes were clear. That was what Barthas noted later. The eyes were completely clear. Some of his men grabbed the soldier's arms immediately and pulled. 2 men, then 3, boots skidding back across the slick floor of the trench. They pulled until their hands went white, and the trapped man made a sound that seemed to come from somewhere structural, from below the level of pain, the sound of something fundamental being tested. They tried looping a belt around his chest. They tried digging at the mud beside him with bare hands, but the walls of the trench were saturated, and the mud simply poured back in faster than they could remove it, indifferent, mechanical, unhurried. The earth was not letting go. It had never let go of anything it wanted. Behind them, the column was moving. The squad ahead had already gone around the next bend and disappeared into the dark. The gap between Barthas's men and the column was growing with every second they stood still. In those trenches at that hour, losing your unit wasn't an inconvenience. It meant wandering alone through a maze of flooded passages until either the cold or the enemy resolved the situation. The war processed stragglers the same way the mud processed everything else, silently, completely, without leaving a trace. The trapped man was looking at Barthas now. He had read something in the expressions around him that nobody had yet put into words. "Put a bullet in me," he said, not loudly, not desperately, the way a man might ask someone to close a door they had left open. Nobody moved. "I'm begging you," he said, "do it now while you can still see my face. Don't leave me here alone when it gets dark and the water gets higher. Please, I'm asking you as a man." Barthas wrote about this moment 30 years later in his notebooks, 19 handwritten journals, kept in a drawer given to no one for decades, the mud-stained record of everything he had witnessed in 4 years at the front. He wrote that the silence following that request was unlike any silence he had experienced during the entire war, deeper than the lull between bombardments, heavier than the quiet after a man died beside him. He wrote that several of his men looked away. He wrote that he himself opened his mouth and then could not find what to put in it. They could not do it, not because they had done a calculation, not because of the Geneva Convention or military law or any other institutional abstraction. They could not do it because none of them could be the specific human being who looked into another man's clear living eyes and pulled the trigger. That final, stubborn, completely irrational refusal was human in a way nothing else about the Western Front was human anymore. And both they and the trapped man understood in that moment that the refusal was its own kind of cruelty, perhaps a worse one than the bullet would have been. Barthas gave the order to move. He had to. The column would not come back for them. They walked away. The boots resumed their rhythm. The voice faded behind them as they went deeper into the trench network, getting smaller and then gone, swallowed by the mud and the dark and the particular silence of no man's land at 2 in the morning. Not one of his men spoke for a long time. Not one of them looked back. He never found out what happened to the man. There was no search party. No report was filed. The mud of northern France had been absorbing men without paperwork since 1914. A soldier who disappeared in a flooded trench at midnight was a number in a column that had already become unreadable from the sheer weight of what it contained. Barthas came home in 1919. He went back to his barrels and his boys and his southern village and his wife who still had the photograph. He never attended veteran ceremonies. He never shook the hands of generals. He wrote instead, filling notebook after notebook with everything he had seen and smelled and heard and refused to do, the complete testimony of an ordinary man who was sent to an extraordinary hell and came back changed in ways that couldn't be talked about at dinner. His notebooks sat in a drawer for 60 years. His grandson found them. A historian named Rémy Casals published them in 1978, 30 years after Barthas died. They are now considered one of the most important primary documents of the First World War. Archaeologists in northern France still find soldiers in the ground every year. Bones, buttons, identification discs when the men are lucky enough to have been buried with them. Each one gets a small ceremony. Most have no name. The mud never gave back what it took. It still hasn't. It was the night before Thanksgiving when John Jones made the decision that would seal his fate inside a mountain of Utah rock forever. He was 26 years old, a medical student at a prestigious program already 3 years deep into training that would make him a doctor, a devoted husband to his wife Emily, who was home that evening tending to their 1-year-old daughter and already well into her second pregnancy. By all accounts, John Jones was exactly the kind of person who made the world feel steadier just by being in it, calm under pressure, deeply faithful, grounded in a way that most people spend entire lifetimes trying to achieve and never quite manage. He was not the reckless type. He was not someone who took needless chances with the things that mattered. He had planned this trip weeks in advance with his brother Josh and a group of 10 close friends, a caving adventure in the Utah desert the evening before Thanksgiving, a last bit of wildness before the warm gathering of family and food and gratitude. He had made a proper reservation. He had signed the liability waiver. He had kissed his daughter on the forehead and told her he would be back for pie. Nutty Putty Cave sat roughly 50 miles south of Salt Lake City, a limestone labyrinth bored into the desert hills by ancient water and time, and it had been drawing adventure seekers for years. The cave's passages bore names that should have registered as warnings to anyone paying close attention. The Birth Canal, the Scout Eater, the Aorta Crawl. These were not playful nicknames assigned carelessly by people with a taste for drama. They were anatomical descriptions of what each passage physically demanded from the human body, trying to force itself through, and the people who named them had chosen every word with a kind of brutal accuracy that experience teaches and cannot be taught any other way. In the years leading up to November 2009, rescue teams had been summoned to Nutty Putty Cave 5 separate times to extract cavers who had become wedged in the stone and could not free themselves. The cave had previously been shut down by state authorities over serious safety concerns, then reopened just 6 months before this night under new management with new protocols and new regulations. There were reservation systems now, there were posted rules, there were rangers on site. For the first hour of the trip, everything unfolded exactly as it was supposed to. The group moved happily through the cave's upper passages, laughing at the tight spots, pressing through narrow crawlways with headlamps catching the glittering formations in the walls around them. They experienced the particular sharp thrill that comes only from being sealed inside the living body of the earth with people you love and trust. Then John decided to find a specific passage called the Birth Canal, one of Nutty Putty's signature experiences, a claustrophobic crawlway that was tight enough to challenge even experienced cavers. He separated from the group and squeezed into a narrow fissure he believed was the correct tunnel. He lowered himself in head first, stomach down, arms pressed flat against his sides, and began inching forward by flexing his shoulders and pushing with his hips. The passage tilted downward sharply. He told himself there would be an opening at the far end, a chamber, a reward. He pushed deeper still. There was no opening. He had entered the completely wrong passage. John Jones found himself inverted inside a vertical crack in the limestone that measured 10 inches wide and 18 inches deep, locked at a 70-degree downward angle, 400 feet from the cave entrance and still moving away from it. His arms were pinned completely flat against his torso by the walls pressing on both sides. He could not raise his head, he could not bend at the waist, he could not push forward any further, and he could not work himself backward. The rock held him the way a closed fist holds something it has quietly decided not to release. His brother Josh located him within minutes. He seized John's ankles and pulled with everything he had in him. John did not move a single measurable inch. Josh called out to the group with a voice that was controlled and very flat. Then he dialed 911 from a phone that could barely pull a signal in the stone, his fingers trembling against the screen. Over the next 27 hours, 137 rescue workers converged on the site. Paramedics, structural engineers, professional cavers, cave rescue specialists. A full command center was established in the desert outside. Floodlights obliterated the night and turned the hillside as bright as midday. Emily drove out and took up her position at the cave entrance, wrapped in a heavy coat, holding their daughter against her chest, watching the ambulances idle in the cold dark and waiting for a man she had no reason yet to stop believing in. The fissure where John was trapped was so catastrophically narrow that only 6 human beings could physically reach him at all. The remaining 100-plus rescue workers were functionally useless beyond the staging area, unable to contribute anything beyond the weight of their presence. Paramedics threaded intravenous lines through the passage to deliver fluids. Engineers drilled steel anchor bolts into the cave wall and constructed a pulley system of 15 tandem blocks, 8 workers at the ropes pulling in perfectly coordinated heaves. For one extraordinary, disbelieving moment, it worked. John's body began to inch upward through the stone. The rescuer closest to his face could see his expression clearly in the lamplight. John was looking back with a trembling, exhausted smile, the smile of a man who understood that the nightmare was ending. The anchor bolt failed catastrophically. The rope went completely slack. The team fell backward. John plunged deeper into the fissure than he had been at any point since becoming trapped, deeper now than before the rescue attempt had even begun. He had been inverted for over 20 hours. The human cardiovascular system is not engineered for sustained inversion. Blood migrates progressively upward into the brain and into the chest cavity. The heart, working against gravity with every single contraction, begins to strain in ways it cannot sustain indefinitely. Fluid accumulates inside the lungs in the condition physicians call pulmonary edema. The trauma doctor monitoring John from the narrow passage beside him understood exactly what the physiology meant. Every hour added to the inversion was another hour of irreversible internal damage, accruing silently, organ by organ, without a single visible wound to mark what was happening inside him. In the final hours of his life, John spoke to Emily by radio through the rock. She was 30 feet above him through solid limestone, and he told her clearly that he loved her. He asked about their daughter by name. He made a small, quiet joke that made the rescuer beside him look away. He comforted the men and women who had pressed themselves into the dark passage to be with him, comforted them when comfort was the thing they should have been giving him. Rescuer Brandon Kowalis would later describe how, in those final hours, John spoke about seeing figures moving in the cave shadows around him. Some of them were angels, he said. Some of them were something else. He described them not with fear, but with a strange, drifting, dissociated calm that those present found more deeply unnerving than any amount of screaming could have been. His breathing had become wet and labored and very slow by then, dragging itself along like something that had already given most of what it had. At 11:56 p.m. on November 25, 2009, John Edward Jones died of cardiac arrest inside Nutty Putty Cave. He was still inverted. He was still 400 feet from the entrance. He was still wearing the smile that the last photograph captured, because right up until nearly the end, he had genuinely believed the rope was going to hold this time. Recovering his body was deemed too dangerous. The rock around the fissure had fractured badly during the rescue attempts. On December 9th, state authorities detonated explosives inside Nutty Putty Cave and collapsed the ceiling above John's position. Then they poured concrete into every entrance, every crack, every opening they could identify. The cave was sealed permanently. It will never be opened again for any reason. John Edward Jones is still inside, still inverted, still in the dark. His wife Emily eventually remarried, moved, and rebuilt a life, and still years later, strangers recognize her face in grocery stores and parking lots and school hallways, and they stop her with that particular expression that has no clean single name, and they say quietly, "I know who you are." Some graves have headstones with dates carved into marble and flowers placed there on weekends. Some are sealed forever with poured concrete in the Utah desert, and the man inside is 26 years old for eternity, and the last thing he felt before the dark arrived was a rope going completely and finally slack. His name was Sergei Preminin. He was 20 years old. He was a seaman, the lowest rank in the Soviet Navy. He had no special training in nuclear reactor systems. He had been assigned to the K-219 the way young men were assigned to things in the Soviet military, because someone needed to go, and he was there. On October 6, 1986, he climbed into the reactor compartment of a sinking submarine that had been on fire for 3 days, turned the shutdown rods on both reactors by hand, and could not get out. The hatch had been sealed from the outside by pressure differential. He died in the reactor compartment of K-219 at the bottom of the North Atlantic. He was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star. He was 20 years old. This is the story of K-219, and it begins 3 days earlier with a sound. October 3, 1986. The K-219, a Yankee-class Soviet ballistic missile submarine, was on a routine Cold War nuclear deterrence patrol in the North Atlantic, approximately 700 miles northeast of Bermuda. She was 15 years old by submarine standards, and she carried 16 R-27U ballistic missiles, each capable of delivering nuclear warheads across thousands of miles of ocean. She was, in the calculus of Cold War deterrence, the thing that made the other side hesitate. A submarine you couldn't find, carrying weapons you couldn't defend against. At 5:14 a.m. Moscow time, a crewman in the forward missile compartment noticed water dripping from under the plug of missile tube number 6. He reported it. The officer on duty reported it up the chain. The watch continued. 5 minutes later, seawater had reached the rocket fuel. The R-27U missile used highly toxic and extremely volatile liquid propellants. When the seawater contacted the fuel residue in the tube, it produced chlorine gas, nitrogen dioxide, and enough heat to trigger a runaway reaction. By 5:32 a.m., the reaction was beyond containment. At 5:38 a.m., missile tube number 6 exploded. The explosion ejected the missile and its nuclear warheads from the submarine into the Atlantic Ocean. The blast killed 2 sailors instantly. A third died minutes later from toxic gas inhalation. Through a breach in the hull, seawater began flooding in, and K-219, which had been at 40 meters depth, began sinking, dropping to over 300 meters before the captain, Commander Igor Britanov, managed to blow all tanks and halt the dive. 25 sailors were trapped in a sealed section. Britanov personally ordered the chief engineer to open the hatch despite the gas contamination risk. The 25 men were pulled out. But the reactors had not automatically shut down as designed. In the chaos of the explosion and the fire and the flooding and the toxic gas filling the compartments, the automatic shutdown system had failed. Both nuclear reactors were still running on a submarine that was burning from the inside, taking on water and drifting on the surface of the North Atlantic, while the captain desperately tried to hold the vessel together with a crew that was vomiting from gas exposure and half blinded by fumes. A nuclear meltdown in the middle of the Atlantic near Bermuda was not a theoretical scenario anymore. Britanov radioed Moscow. Moscow's response was not, "What do you need?" Moscow's response was, in effect, "Why can't you fix this?" The Politburo, when informed, immediately worried about 2 things: whether the Americans would try to salvage the wreck for intelligence, and whether the crew's actions constituted incompetence or cowardice. Gorbachev would later ask, in a recorded Politburo meeting that was classified for decades and released by American archivists, whether the crew's panic had caused the accident, or whether crew cowardice had made it worse. A Soviet merchant vessel, the Anatoly Vasilyev, arrived and attached a tow line to the K-219. The plan was to bring her home. Soviet submarines carried their secrets, and a wreck on the ocean floor near Bermuda was unacceptable, too close to American waters, too accessible for CIA recovery operations like Project Azorian, which had already demonstrated the American willingness and capability to raise Soviet submarines from the deep. The tow line held for a while. For 3 days, K-219 sat on the surface, a floating disaster. Corrosive gases were eating through the submarine's internal piping. The reactor compartment was inaccessible from inside. The radiation and gas levels were lethal. The ship was slowly dying around the men who were trying to save her, and Moscow kept asking why they couldn't do more. On October 6, 3 days after the explosion, flooding inside the submarine reached a point beyond recovery. The tow line from the merchant vessel broke. The K-219 was sinking. This is when Sergei Preminin volunteered. He had already made one trip into the reactor compartment. He and another sailor, an officer, had gone in together to attempt manual shutdown. The officer had been overcome by heat and radiation and had to be pulled out. Preminin had stayed longer. He had turned one of the 4 shutdown rods by hand. Each rod required significant physical effort to move. He had come out alive the first time. He went back in alone. He turned the second reactor's shutdown rods. Both nuclear reactors were now secured. A nuclear disaster in the North Atlantic had been prevented by a 20-year-old seaman turning metal rods by hand in a compartment full of radiation and superheated air. He tried to open the hatch. The pressure differential from outside, the submarine listing flooding, the compartment pressure changing, had created a seal he couldn't break alone. He could not open it from inside. He tried. He kept trying. The K-219 sank at 11:03 a.m. on October 6, 1986. It took 34 nuclear warheads and 2 nuclear reactors to the bottom of the Hatteras abyssal plain at a depth of 6,000 meters, nearly 20,000 feet. It is still there. Sergei Preminin is still there. Commander Britanov was subsequently charged with negligence, sabotage, and treason. He was never imprisoned. The charges were eventually dropped in 1987 when a change in Soviet leadership reshuffled the politics around who was responsible for what. Britanov went home. He had been the last man to leave the K-219 alive, abandoning ship only seconds before she went under. He had done everything a captain could do and watched it not be enough. The K-219 has 34 nuclear warheads on it, reactor fuel, all of it in 20,000 feet of water at the bottom of the North Atlantic, in a submarine that has been down there for nearly 40 years, rusting, slowly compromising. In 1988, a mere submersible documented that the hull was already showing significant deterioration. No country has claimed responsibility for the environmental monitoring of the wreck. The radioactive material will remain on the ocean floor, leaking into the surrounding water on a timeline measured in geological rather than human time. 20-year-old Sergei Preminin prevented a nuclear explosion. He did it with his bare hands. He is still at the bottom of the North Atlantic. He has never been recovered. He was posthumously awarded a medal. The K-219 is not the only nuclear wreck on the ocean floor. The USS Scorpion lies at 9,800 feet with nuclear weapons aboard. The USS Thresher's reactor is at 8,400 feet. These are known, documented, partly declassified facts. Nuclear material sits on the ocean floor in multiple locations, monitored inconsistently, in vessels degrading at their own geological pace. But K-219 carries something the others don't: a person. Sergei Preminin is still in the reactor compartment. He has never been recovered. He is classified as lost at sea. The captain who survived him, Igor Britanov, was charged, tried, and eventually acquitted after political reshuffling made his prosecution inconvenient. He went home. He wrote a memoir. He has said that he thinks about Preminin. The Politburo meeting at which Gorbachev asked whether the crew had panicked was declassified by American archivists, not Russian ones, and released through the National Security Archive in Washington. The Russian government has released very little about K-219 beyond the basics. The warheads are still there. In 2001, a Norwegian-Russian expedition photographed the wreck. The hull was already significantly deteriorated: rust, biological growth, structural compromise in areas that had burned or flooded. The missile tubes were partially open. What is happening to the nuclear material inside, at 20,000 feet, in the long, slow dark of the abyssal plain, belongs to a timeline longer than the governments that put it there. Sergei Preminin was 20 years old. He climbed into a reactor compartment on a sinking submarine, turned 2 rods by hand, prevented what would have been the largest nuclear accident in the history of the Atlantic Ocean, and then could not open the hatch. He is still at 20,000 feet. The reactor he secured has been cold for decades. The ship around him has been rusting since 1986. The warheads he protected the ocean from are in a slow dissolution that no government is formally responsible for monitoring. He was 20 years old. He is still there. His brother had been dead for 2 years when the warm hands woke him. Corporal Will R. Bird of the 42nd Battalion, the Black Watch of Canada, was not a man given to stories about the supernatural. He was from Nova Scotia, from a small town called Amherst, a place of practical people who worked with their hands and measured the world in distances and weather and the specific reliability of equipment. He had come to the war the hard way. He had tried to enlist in August 1914 at the age of 23 and been rejected because his teeth were broken from a hockey injury. He went home while his younger brother Stephen enlisted and sailed for France in 1915. Stephen was 22 years old. Before he left, he said something to Will that Will wrote down later and never forgot. "If I don't come back, maybe I'll find a way to come sometime and whisper in your ear." Stephen was killed in October 1915, a German mine explosion in the Ypres sector. He was buried in France in ground that would be shelled into an unrecognizable landscape within 6 months. When the telegram came to Amherst, Will Bird read it twice, put it in a drawer, and went to the Army recruitment office the following morning. He had teeth removed to meet the physical standard. He was accepted. He sailed in early 1916. He became a sniper first, then a patrolman, the soldiers who went out into no man's land at night to observe enemy positions, to cut or repair wire, and to return before dawn with whatever information they had gathered and whatever pieces of themselves they had managed to keep intact in the dark. It was work that required the ability to stay completely still for extended periods in cold, wet darkness, to hear sounds at distances that most people never train their hearing to reach, and to make calm decisions about life and death in conditions that were designed to make calm decisions impossible. Bird was good at it. He survived Passchendaele and Arras and Cambrai and the Vimy-Lens sector and the final 100 grinding days of the war. He survived because he was skilled, and because he was careful, and because of something else. Something he wrote about in 2 separate published books, and that he maintained to anyone who asked him for the rest of his long life was absolutely and literally true. It was the days immediately following the Battle of Vimy Ridge, April 1917. The Canadian Corps had just accomplished something the British and French armies had failed at repeatedly over 3 years. They had taken the ridge from the Germans, a military achievement that became a defining moment of Canadian national identity and cost more than 4,000 Canadian lives in 4 days of fighting. The landscape around the ridge was destruction of surpassing completeness. No tree above knee height, no structure above rubble. The entire surface of the earth rearranged into a geometry of craters and wire and the equipment of men who no longer needed equipment. Bird had been on a nighttime work detail, digging new trench sections, stringing wire along the forward positions in the dark, the ordinary brutal labor that followed a battle whose outcome had been settled but whose danger had not diminished. He finished after midnight, exhausted at a depth below which exhaustion has any useful name, and found 2 men from his platoon who offered to share their bivouac, a small shelter dug into an embankment, a ground sheet fastened across the opening to hold in warmth. He crawled in. He was asleep almost immediately. He woke to pressure on his hands, not on his face, not on his shoulder, on both hands simultaneously, a warm, firm grip, the kind that means intention rather than accident. He opened his eyes in the dark interior of the bivouac and looked at what was holding them. It was Stephen. Not a shape that resembled Stephen, not a trick of darkness and exhaustion, not the visual hallucination that sleep deprivation can produce in men who have been half awake for 30 hours in a landscape designed to generate maximum fear. It was his brother, in uniform, looking at him with an expression Bird described as deeply calm. Not the blankness of shock, but the specific, focused calm of a person who knows exactly what they're doing and has very limited time to do it. Stephen gripped his hands, held them long enough that Bird was fully awake and could not mistake what he was seeing, and then rose and moved toward the entrance of the shelter. He turned once, at the opening. He gestured for Will to follow. Bird gathered his equipment and went after him. They moved through the trenches, past dugouts where Bird could see the sleeping shapes of men from his platoon, past the supply areas and communication passages and the endless mud of the post-battle ground. Bird followed his dead brother through a landscape so thoroughly destroyed it had ceased to resemble anything that had ever been France. They moved for several minutes in silence, the way brothers sometimes move together, without needing to explain direction or purpose. Then Bird's equipment shifted on his shoulder and fell, and in the moment he bent to recover it, Stephen turned a corner ahead and was gone. Bird followed the corner. There was nothing there but empty trench and darkness. He stood in the cold for a long time, not moving. Then, behind him, he heard the explosion. A German artillery shell had struck the bivouac, a direct hit, the exact point in the embankment where Bird had been sleeping, where 2 men from his platoon had still been sleeping, men who had not been woken by warm hands in the night, was destroyed. The shelter was gone. Both men were dead. Bird told his platoon what had happened. He told his sergeant. He wrote it in his diary that same night, in handwriting that was reportedly steady, the way it always was because Bird was that kind of man. He wrote about it again in his 1930 memoir, And We Go On. He wrote about it again in the book he published in 1968, the book he named after the most specific detail he could never explain, Ghosts Have Warm Hands. Across 38 years and 2 separate published accounts, he never changed a single detail. He was a journalist and a novelist, professionally trained in the difference between what happened and what could be improved by invention. He maintained, without variation, that he was describing exactly and only what he had experienced. Tim Cook, the Canadian War Museum's leading historian of the First World War, studied Bird's accounts extensively and wrote about them in the Journal of Military History. Whatever interpretation one applied to the incident, supernatural, psychological, the product of grief operating on a mind primed by years of extreme vigilance, the emotional truth it contained was representative of something universal among the men of the Western Front. The dead were never entirely absent from those trenches. They were in the soil under every boot, in the air everyone breathed, in the faces of every living man who was slowly becoming one of them. The barrier between the living and the dead on the Western Front was not a wall, it was a membrane. Bird survived the war. He won the Military Medal for Bravery on the final day of fighting, November 11, 1918, at Mons, Belgium. He came home. He named his only son Stephen. That son grew up reading his father's war writing. He enlisted in the Second World War. He went ashore at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. He was killed in France on July 8, 1944. Will Bird spent the last 40 years of his life believing that his writing had sent his son to war and that his son's death was therefore, in some essential way, his fault. He lived until 1984. He wrote until the end. He never changed the story about the hands. He said it the same way every time. The hands were warm. Not cold, not the cold of the ground or the cold of France in April or the cold of a man who had been in the earth for 2 years. Warm. Like a brother who had come a long way to find him and was running out of time and needed him to get up and follow right now before it was too late. It was a beautiful summer morning when they went in. By that same evening, 6 of them were dead, and the cave would be sealed forever over their bodies. On June 24, 1967, a group of 10 cavers descended into the Mossdale Caverns in the Yorkshire Dales of northern England. Most of them young men in their late teens and early 20s, students and enthusiasts connected to Leeds University and local caving clubs who gathered on weekends to push deeper into the limestone networks beneath the moors. The eldest in the group was 26 years old, the youngest was 17. Their informal leader was a man named Dave Adamson, an experienced and respected caver who knew the Mossdale system well enough to navigate its worst passages. He was engaged to be married in 6 weeks. His fiancée was a woman named Morag Forbes, and she was one of the 10 who descended into the cave that morning. Mossdale had a reputation among serious cavers. It was not a beginner's system. Its passages were long, wet, brutally tight, low crawlways through black mud and standing water, some requiring hours of horizontal shuffling with barely enough vertical clearance to turn one's head. The cave ran underneath the open moorland above, connected to the moor's surface drainage in ways that made it extraordinarily dangerous in wet weather. But the group knew the cave and the weather that morning gave no concern. They had been in it before, some of them many times. The sky above the Yorkshire moors was clear blue, and the moorland grasses were summer green, and there was absolutely nothing visible from the surface to suggest that by nightfall everything would be destroyed. After several hours of exploration, 4 members of the group chose to turn back. They were tired, they had seen what they came to see, and the squeeze back through the tightest sections was always harder than the push in. Morag Forbes was among the four who turned back. She squeezed through the low entrance passage and pulled herself out onto the surface, blinking in the afternoon light. What she found waiting for her on the surface was not an afternoon, it was a disaster already in progress. While the group had been underground, a storm had broken over the Yorkshire moors above, sudden, severe, and completely invisible from inside the cave, where no sound from the surface ever penetrates. Mossdale Beck, the small stream that fed into the cave entrance, had transformed from its normal trickle into a roaring brown flood that was pouring directly into the cave mouth at tremendous volume. When Morag reached the entrance, it was completely submerged. The 6 men who had pushed further into the cave, Dave Adamson and 5 others, were now sealed inside a rapidly flooding cave system with no way out and no warning that anything had changed at all. Morag Forbes ran. She did not stop to assess or to plan. She ran 4 kilometers across open moorland in caving boots, over rough grass and wet ground, toward the nearest farm to raise an alarm. She ran the way a person runs when they understand with perfect clarity that the difference between fast enough and not quite fast enough is measured in lives. The alarm went out through every caving club and emergency service in Yorkshire and beyond. Over 200 rescue workers converged on Mossdale before morning was done. They faced a problem with no clean solution. The flood was total, the entrance was buried under rushing water, and there was no way to simply wait it out, because every minute that passed was a minute less for the 6 men inside. Engineers and volunteers dug a massive diversion trench through the night, 6 feet wide, 10 feet deep, 100 yards long, attempting to redirect enough of the floodwater away from the cave entrance to allow entry. They also built an emergency earthen dam. They worked through the darkness with shovels and machinery and the particular furious energy of people who know exactly what is at stake and are not yet ready to stop believing it can still end differently. When the water finally dropped enough to allow entry, a rescue team pushed in. The passages of Mossdale on a dry day were already formidable, long crawlways through cold mud and standing water, the kind of spaces that eat time and crush courage. Now they were choked with flood debris, tangled with debris the water had carried in, and in several places nearly completely blocked. The team moved slowly, methodically, pushing deeper into the system toward where the group was believed to have been exploring. In a section of the cave called Far Marathon, 900 feet long, 2 feet wide, 10 inches high at its lowest point, team member Tony Waltham was leading the advance. He crawled forward into the darkness with his headlamp throwing light on the mud-slicked walls close on either side. He found the first 2 bodies in the passage itself, wedged into the crawlway by the force of the water. He made the decision to crawl over them. 3 more were in the passages just beyond. By the time the rest of his team had forced themselves through to where he was, several experienced adult rescue workers were weeping in the dark, faces pressed against the mud, unable to proceed. Waltham turned back to the team leader behind him and said, with the directness of a man who has no useful alternative, "Go back, Jim, they're all dead." The 6th caver, 21-year-old John Ogden, was not among the 5 bodies found in Far Marathon. John Ogden was one of the most skilled cavers in the group, experienced, technically proficient, the kind of person who might, in some thin margin of possibility, have found an air pocket, a ledge, a fragment of survivable space. Rescue teams came back over the following days. They made the crawl past the bodies of Ogden's 5 companions again and again, searching further into the cave with the desperate repetition of people who are not yet ready to accept what they already know. They found his gold signet ring first, placed deliberately in a visible spot in the passage, a marker left by a man who was still thinking clearly enough to leave signs for the people he believed were coming for him. Then they found the sole of his boot, separated by the force of the water. Then, squeezed into a crack beyond anywhere the water should have permitted a person to reach, they found John Ogden. He had fought further into the cave than any of the others, clawing through the flooding passages toward a pocket of breathable air that did not exist. He had made it further than should have been possible. It was not far enough. The coroner sealed the cave. The 6 bodies were declared impossible to recover safely without endangering additional lives. Dave Adamson, Jeff Boireau, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Michael Ryan and Colin Vickers were left where the flood had placed them, entombed in the Yorkshire limestone, in the dark, in the cold, in the cave they had entered on a bright summer morning 6 weeks before a wedding that never happened. 4 years later, a small and quietly determined group of fellow cavers from the same clubs and communities broke through the sealed entrance in secret, under cover of night, without authorization from any authority. They moved the 6 bodies to a deeper chamber above the floodline, a place where the water could never reach them again no matter how hard the moors rained, and they gave it a name. They called it the Sanctuary, which is exactly what it was and what it remains. On the moorland surface above Mossdale, a stone cairn was built at the spot where the beck meets the cave entrance. The inscription reads, Mossdale Memorial Cairn, over the place in the cave where the bodies were found. The cave itself remains sealed. No access is granted for any reason. The official caving guidebooks list the Mossdale Caverns with a notation that has not changed in decades. Warning, liable to total flooding, all expeditions inadvisable. Some cavers go in anyway. They know the history, they have read the names, they pick a clear, dry morning when there is not a cloud anywhere over the Yorkshire moors, and they go in because they believe that this time the weather will hold. It was clear and dry and summer green the morning Dave Adamson's group went in too. At approximately 130 feet, the ocean begins to do something to the human brain. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a warning or a noticeable transition. One moment you are a diver, trained and equipped, in possession of all your faculties. And then, gradually and completely without your consent, you are not. They call it nitrogen narcosis. They also call it the rapture of the deep. The name is not metaphorical. This is about what happens when the most reliable instrument in your possession, your own mind, becomes the thing that is trying to kill you. And the ocean is 8,000 feet deep, and you are 130 feet down, and you have absolutely no idea anything is wrong. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe. At sea level, at normal pressure, this is fine. But underwater, as depth increases, pressure increases too. 1 additional atmosphere of pressure for every 33 feet of descent. Under pressure, nitrogen behaves differently in human tissue. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It binds to receptors in the central nervous system. The mechanism is, in its precise operation, still not fully understood. The effect, however, is extremely well documented. At around 30 meters, approximately 100 feet, the nitrogen compressed into your bloodstream and tissues begins to produce an intoxicating effect comparable to several measures of alcohol consumed very quickly. Your confidence rises, your judgment degrades, your memory begins to slip, your perception of time changes, your emotional regulation softens. You may feel euphoric, you may feel nothing at all, and critically and most terrifyingly, you cannot tell. The research on this point is consistent across decades of military and civilian diving medicine. Nitrogen narcosis does not feel like being impaired, it feels like clarity. Divers under narcosis frequently report feeling sharper, more focused, more confident than usual. They make wrong decisions and feel certain those decisions are right. They look at their gauges and read incorrect numbers. They signal to their dive buddies that everything is fine and they believe it and they are dying. Commercial diver Sherry Ferguson, who has studied nitrogen narcosis at Simon Fraser University for years, puts it this way: in hindsight, you are clearly impaired. In the moment, you rarely are. The cases that make this real are the ones that survive to be documented. In Egypt, at the dive site near Dahab known as the Blue Hole, a vertical underwater sinkhole that drops to over 300 feet and is among the most statistically deadly recreational dive sites in the world, a diver is conducting a 40-meter certification dive with an instructor. They are at depth. The instructor administers a standard narcosis check, a math problem. The diver solves it correctly, faster than he would have on the surface. He is proud of this. He passes. He then proceeds to confuse the inflator button on his buoyancy vest with the dump valve. The inflator fills the vest with air. He begins to sink. His legs kick automatically, propelling him upward in his mind. He is smiling. He is absolutely certain he is ascending. The video footage from the surface shows him kicking steadily downward, grinning, into deeper water. His instructor intercepted him. That story ends with the diver alive on a dive boat watching the footage, unable to reconcile the smiling, sinking figure with his memory of a perfectly normal dive. He said he felt fine the entire time. He said he was sure he was going up. In Canada, a diver on a winter dive at 32 meters experiences the onset of narcosis unexpectedly. Cold water is a known accelerant of the condition. The ocean floor transforms in her perception into a two-dimensional cartoon landscape. Her dive buddy, a person she has dived with dozens of times, becomes to her eyes a soulless outline, drawn in felt pen against a flat underwater background. She described it afterward as a Charlie Brown animation. She knew something was wrong. She was not sure what. She checked her gauges, she could read them, but processing what the numbers meant took effort that normally required none. She made it to the surface. She described fissures in her trust of enclosed spaces that lasted months afterward. At the Blue Hole of Dahab, which has claimed an estimated 130 to 200 diver lives, more than any other dive site on the planet, nitrogen narcosis is a contributing factor in most of the deaths. The site features an arch at approximately 55 meters that divers attempt to swim through, ascending on the other side. At 55 meters, narcosis is severe. Divers attempting the arch have been found at the bottom, apparently continuing to swim in the wrong direction, having become completely disoriented about which way was up. One of the documented features of advanced narcosis at depths beyond 50 meters is that it can produce terror. Not confusion, not euphoria, pure, absolute, incomprehensible terror that arrives without identifiable cause. You are fully conscious, you are in your equipment, the water is the same water it was at 20 meters, nothing has changed that your rational mind can identify, and yet you are more afraid than you have ever been in your life, with no information to explain why, and no reliable cognitive process remaining to help you manage it. Your body wants to bolt for the surface. This is the death scenario. Ascending too quickly from depth, from gases dissolved in tissue under pressure, causes decompression sickness. The nitrogen that narcosis has been delivering to your tissues comes out of solution as bubbles, the way carbonation escapes a shaken bottle when opened. Bubbles in joints, bubbles in the spinal cord, bubbles in the brain. The bends can paralyze, the bends can kill, and so the correct response to wanting to bolt for the surface, to run, to escape, to get out of the water as fast as possible, is to go slowly, breathe, ascend at a measured rate, stop at decompression depths and wait, follow the algorithm, trust the process. This is what you must do when your brain is drunk and terrified and convinced that the safest thing in the world is to go up right now as fast as you can. The instructor cases in these records are perhaps the most quietly disturbing. In one documented incident, a dive instructor, a person who has conducted hundreds of dives, who has trained dozens of students, who knows the signs of narcosis in others because she has spent her career watching for them, develops narcosis on a deep training dive and becomes completely certain for several minutes that she needs to take her regulator out of her mouth. Not to signal distress, not to share air, she simply becomes, in the grip of the rapture, absolutely convinced that she no longer needs it. She did not remove it. Something in the remaining functional layer of her cognition stopped her. She surfaced safely. She described the experience as feeling, in retrospect, like watching herself from outside her body, watching herself nearly do something that would have been immediately and certainly fatal, and being unable to explain why it had seemed reasonable. The ocean at depth is not an environment that forgives a mind that cannot be trusted. It is dark, and the pressure is real, and the cold moves through equipment that was not designed for long exposure, and the nitrogen is always there, in the air in your tank, in the blood in your body, doing its patient, invisible work at the cellular level. You cannot feel it arriving, you cannot feel it taking hold. You feel fine until you don't, and when you don't, the thing that would normally notice something is wrong is the same thing that is wrong. The rapture of the deep is a real diagnosis, documented in naval and civilian medicine for nearly 200 years. Victor Junod described it in 1834, Jacques Cousteau named it. The Navy has run controlled studies, the physics are understood, the mechanism in the brain is studied in hyperbaric chambers. And yet it happens every diving season to experienced divers, to instructors, to people who have logged hundreds of dives and know every sign. Because knowing the signs only helps if the part of you that reads signs is still working. At 130 feet, with the ocean above you and the dark below, the most dangerous thing in the water is not the pressure or the cold or whatever might be moving in the darkness at the edge of your visibility. It is the feeling that everything is fine. The worst part was never the weight of the earth. It was the silence. By the time the weight arrived, the ceiling caving, the walls folding inward, the sudden compression of what had been breathable air into something pressing and absolute, the silence had already begun. The silence was what the earth left you with when it was done moving. The silence was the medium you inhabited while you were still breathing and the world above you was not. Trench burial, being sealed alive under collapsed earth following an artillery strike, was among the most common fates on the Western Front and among the least discussed. There are reasons for this. Men who survived it were not, in the immediate aftermath, in any condition to write things down. The accounts they gave later, when they could speak again, tended to produce a specific reaction in listeners, a controlled retreat behind the eyes, a polite stillness that made the survivors stop mid-sentence and decide not to continue. And the men who didn't survive it left no record at all. They were simply gone, listed as missing or killed by shellfire, filed in a column of numbers that had become too large to read as anything except numbers. The figures are irrecoverable with any precision. Historian Tim Cook, researching the Canadian Expeditionary Force alone, found repeated references in unit diaries and medical records to men being entombed following bombardments, dug out hours or days afterward, sometimes alive, sometimes not alive but still warm, sometimes simply not there in any recoverable sense. The British and French armies processed similar events in similar volumes, multiplied across 4 years of continuous shelling along 12,000 miles of fortified line. Artillery caused approximately 60% of all casualties on the Western Front. A significant portion of those casualties were not men killed by the shell itself, but men killed by what the shell did to the ground around them. The secondary consequences, the earth turned into a weapon by the force of the initial event. You were sitting in a dugout. This is how most of the accounts begin. You were sitting in the dugout doing something ordinary, eating, writing, cleaning your rifle, listening to someone else talk, and then the world compressed. The sound of the shell landing was often not remembered because the brain, under sufficient extremity, edits the input immediately preceding catastrophe. What the men reported was not the impact, it was the aftermath. The absolute total dark, the weight across the legs, the texture of soil against the face, gritty, cool, immediate, and the question that arrived with extraordinary clarity in the first seconds: how much air is there, and how long will it last? A French soldier, whose account was transcribed at a military hospital in Rouen in 1919, described coming to consciousness in complete darkness. He could not move his legs. He could move his left arm to a radius of approximately 4 inches before it met solid resistance. He could turn his head slightly to the left. He could breathe, but the breathing costs more with each cycle, the way a resource depletes faster when you're working hard and the supply isn't being replenished. He lay still and calculated as clearly as he could. He estimated he had been there for 2 or 3 hours, though he acknowledged this estimate was unreliable. Time in enclosed darkness without reference points operates on different principles than time in the open world. He screamed initially. Most of the accounts include this stage because it is not optional. The body's response to being sealed underground is immediate and involuntary regardless of military training or personal composure. After the screaming, a different kind of calculation begins. You become aware of your own oxygen consumption. You become aware that screaming accelerates it significantly. You become aware that stillness is, in measurable terms, a survival strategy. You become very, very still. This soldier, lying in the dark, became aware that the surface pressing against the right side of his face was not soil. The texture was different. He turned his head fractionally and pressed his cheek against it, and the shape of it registered in his hands before his mind was willing to process the shape, the specific curved firmness of something that had once been a shoulder joint, the weight and density of a thing that had finished settling. The fabric had been soaked and dried many times. He turned his face away and breathed very carefully and did not think about what he had just touched. He was not buried in a fresh collapse. This is what the worst accounts have in common. The discovery, made in darkness and limited movement, that the earth around them had been disturbed before, that the ground into which they had been compressed had already been used for something. Artillery shells churned the soil of northern France with total mechanical indifference to what the soil contained, and what it contained, by 1916 and certainly by 1917, was a mixture of geological material and the remains of men who had been buried in previous bombardments, and the remains of men who had been buried before them, layer upon layer, going back to the first winter of the war. The force of a new explosion didn't distinguish between these layers, it simply mixed them together and redistributed them. The soldier was dug out 9 hours later. He walked afterward. He returned to his village, married, raised children. He was by all outward appearances a functional human being for the remainder of his life, which was reasonably long. His family knew there was a locked room inside him. They knew this the way families always know without being told, but they didn't know what was in it. He told one person once, the doctor in Rouen in 1919 who was conducting the first systematic attempt to document what the Western Front had done to the men who came back from it. The doctor wrote it down in the flat, affectless prose of clinical documentation, the medical profession's method for managing proximity to the extreme. The file is in a French military archive. The soldier's name is redacted. His village is listed as somewhere in the Dordogne. His case number is 4,847. Which means there were 4,846 cases documented before his. In northern France and Belgium, they are still finding soldiers in the earth, every year, beneath construction sites, beneath the foundations of houses built on what is now ordinary suburban land, beneath agricultural fields that have been plowed for 3 generations. They surface when the ground is disturbed deeply enough, or when heavy rain shifts what the soil has held for a century. The French government employs teams specifically for this work, recovery and ordnance disposal combined, because the men and the unexploded shells are often found together, because the war did not sort these things neatly before burying them. Most of the recovered soldiers cannot be identified. They are interred in military cemeteries with small white stones and the phrase "unknown soldier." There are more of them in the ground than have ever been found. The earth of the Western Front gave back what it chose to give back, when it chose, and kept the rest. It is still keeping it now. The Belgian and French governments estimate that at current recovery rates, the last soldier will not be found for another 500 years. 500 years of white stones, 500 years of unknown soldier, 500 years of the Earth slowly releasing what it decided in 1916 or 1917 or 1918 to take. It kept the man in Barthas's trench. It kept the men who went into no man's land. It kept 4,846 documented cases and an uncounted number of undocumented ones. It kept the silence. The silence that comes after the wait. The silence that waits in the dark while you are still breathing, measuring your air, learning to hold very still. The silence is still down there. In the deep ground of northern France, 9 inches below plough depth, where the roots of the crops don't reach and the frost doesn't reach and the sound of the surface world is distant and slow and very quiet. Still waiting for someone to listen. Nobody warned Floyd Collins that the January morning he dropped into Sand Cave in Kentucky would be the last time he would ever see open sky. Then again, no warning could have prepared him for what the Earth had quietly decided to do with him. Floyd Collins was 37 years old in the winter of 1925, born and raised in the limestone hill country of Kentucky, and he had been exploring caves since he was 6 years old. Since childhood, he had been crawling through underground passages with nothing but a kerosene lantern to hold the dark back, navigating by instinct and the particular brand of fearlessness that grows in people who have spent years in places that would shatter most others. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had barely finished primary school, but underground, Floyd Collins was as gifted as any person alive. He had already discovered one remarkable cave system on his family's property, a glittering underground world he named Crystal Cave for the formations that covered its walls like a cathedral's windows catching light. It should have made his fortune. It did not. Crystal Cave was located too far from the main highway. Tourists and paying visitors would not make the extra journey. The automobile was reshaping America, and in 1925, if your attraction was not close to a road, you were invisible to the world above ground. Floyd understood this problem with the focused intensity of a man who had been thinking about it for years, and he had been scouting the surrounding fields looking for a solution. He was convinced there was something spectacular just below the surface of a particular stretch of land near the Mammoth Cave area, something close to the road, something the tourists would actually drive to see, something that would finally change everything for the Collins family. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, he lowered himself alone into a narrow hole in the ground on a neighbor's property that would later be named Sand Cave. He moved through the initial passages on his stomach, pushing his kerosene lantern ahead of him through crawlways sometimes only 9 or 10 inches high, the limestone pressing against his back and his chest at the same time. An hour into the descent, he found exactly what he had been dreaming of finding, a vaulted underground chamber of genuine beauty, enormous and cathedral quiet, with formations rising from the floor like frozen waterfalls. And it was barely 300 feet from the cave entrance. The main highway was within easy sight distance above. This was the one. After years of searching, this was finally the cave that would change everything. Then his lantern began to flicker. Floyd moved fast. He understood better than almost any person alive what it meant to lose your light underground. He turned himself around in the narrow passage and began pushing back toward the entrance, moving with urgency now, pushing with his hips and elbows while the flame guttered and threw strange shadows. His left foot caught on what he believed was a solid shelf of rock. The passage shifted, and a boulder estimated at 27 pounds dropped from the ceiling directly onto his left ankle, pinning it completely against the cave floor. He was 55 feet below the surface. He was entirely alone. The lantern burned out its final drops of fuel. He began calling for help in the absolute dark, and no one was anywhere close enough to hear him. 2 full days passed before anyone reached him. His neighbor Jewel Estes found him first. Then his brother Homer made the terrifying crawl in and discovered Floyd alive, mentally sharp, and somehow still making dry jokes in a voice that had been alone in the dark for 48 hours. The passage to reach him was brutally and almost impossibly narrow, so tight that a broad-shouldered man simply could not enter at all. Only the smallest and slimmest people could reach Floyd, which meant that the vast majority of the growing rescue force assembling outside the cave was physically incapable of contributing anything meaningful. A young journalist named William Burke Miller, small and slight, known by his nickname Skeets, worked for the Louisville Courier-Journal and was slim enough to squeeze his body through the passage. He began making the awful crawl in regularly, bringing food, water, whiskey, and a notepad. His dispatches from inside the tunnel describing Floyd's condition, his dry humor, his extraordinary dignity in the face of what should have been a breaking situation, made Floyd Collins a nationwide sensation within days. Radio was new, and Americans were utterly transfixed by it, and the story of the Kentucky caveman trapped alone and alive underground was exactly the kind of raw human drama that the medium was made to amplify. At the peak of the coverage, crowds of 15,000 people gathered on the hillside above Sand Cave. Food vendors and souvenir sellers and carnival barkers set up operations on the frozen ground. Newspaper reporters arrived from cities across the country, and below all of them, 55 feet down in a crack in the Kentucky earth, Floyd Collins lay in the dark and listened to water drip on his face. The dripping water had never once stopped from the first hour. Icy groundwater fell on his exposed skin in a steady, patient, perfectly merciless rhythm. It did not injure him, it simply never stopped, a constant cold percussion against his face and neck, ticking like a clock that was counting down towards something neither he nor anyone above him wanted to name. Rescue attempts failed one after another in ways that seemed almost designed to maximize despair. Workers tried to hoist Floyd with rope and harness and could not navigate the angled passage. They attempted to widen the tunnel with hand tools and nearly brought the ceiling down entirely. The teenage boys sent into the passage to deliver food and blankets became frightened in the narrowing dark and stuffed the supplies into wall cracks instead of pushing forward. Floyd received almost none of what was sent to him. After 9 agonizing days, the roof of the passage directly above Floyd Collins collapsed. He was sealed in, completely and permanently cut off from any human contact. No more food, no more warmth, no more voices, no more light of any kind. Just the cold pressing stone, the relentless drip of water on his face, and the kind of silence that has weight. The only remaining option was to sink a rescue shaft straight down from the surface. Engineers plotted the position, workers dug through the winter ground around the clock in rotating shifts. The carnival above kept selling refreshments while Floyd Collins lay dying directly beneath the midway. The shaft reached him on February 16, 1925, 17 days after he first fell into the trap. Rescuers lowered themselves down and pushed through to where he lay. Floyd Collins was dead. The coroner estimated he had died around February 13th of exposure and starvation in the absolute dark, 3 full days before the shaft reached him. The story did not end there. Floyd's body was eventually moved to Crystal Cave, the one too far from the road to succeed, placed in a glass-topped coffin and exhibited to paying tourists for years while families filed past and his face looked up at them through the glass lid. Then in March of 1929, his body was stolen from the coffin in the night. It was found in a field nearby. His left leg, the one the boulder had pinned, the one that had pressed against cold limestone for 17 days, the limb that started all of this, was never recovered. It remains missing to this day. No explanation was ever given. No one was ever charged. Floyd Collins spent his whole life convinced he was one great discovery away from everything changing for the better. He was right about that. He found his cave. He found his highway. He found the discovery that would make his name known across the entire country. His story was broadcast into living rooms in every state. Songs were written about him, poems, newspaper editorials. Floyd Collins became the most famous man in America for 3 weeks in January and February of 1925. He just never got to enjoy any of it. He never found his way back up from the dark, and the dark never offered to let him go. Thank you for making it to the end. Please like and subscribe if you loved listening to the stories. Comment below to share if you found something disturbing. Thanks again for your support. See you soon with some new stories shared by real people.